This week on Act Out, 16 activists fighting the overt rise of fascism find themselves in the crosshairs of our justice system. We take a look at the detention of migrant children, the celebration of white supremacist imperialism, and how folks are standing up for justice. Next up, there's precious little ancient forest left in this world, and a patch in Northern California is quite literally on the chop block. We sit down with a forest protector for a look into the grotesque world of logging and destroying in the Mattole watershed. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. 2 weeks ago, 16 people found to their surprise that El Paso police had issued warrants for their arrest. The crime? Protesting the inhumane detention of children and the separation of families at the border. On February 16th, activists with Tornillo the Occupation, which we covered in episode 191, walked into the Border Patrol Museum in El Paso, Texas. They carried signs and banners, sang and peacefully held the space to bring attention to, in particular, the deaths of Jacqueline Calmaquin, Felipe Gomez Alonso, and Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, 3 migrant youth who have died in Border Patrol custody in recent months. Activists posted up pictures of the 3 children throughout the museum, pointing out the importance of this action in their press release, saying, quote, "We took action because the museum and spaces like it exhibit a one-sided perspective of what is happening on the border. Nowhere in the museum would you find the problematic reality of the Border Patrol and its history of oppressive treatment towards indigenous peoples of this land, asylum seekers, and migrants. Our presence in the space was to center the voices that were missing from this memorial and the human rights violations inflicted upon them. Jacqueline Calmaquin, Felipe Gomez Alonso, Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez, and the more than 100 others who have died as consequences of Border Patrol violence. They died in Border Patrol spaces. They deserve to be remembered in Border Patrol spaces." In watching the 15-minute video posted with this press release, you can see the activists slowly trickle into the museum, singing and setting up their banners, while a few folks walk around with the pictures of the 3 children. At around 2 minutes, someone announces that the staff has called the police, and upon hearing this, a few folks leave. The rest of the group keeps singing. As the singing tapers, a few speakers share their stories and their messages, including indigenous peoples whose ancestors lived in what is now called El Paso. One woman wraps up by saying all migrants are welcome on this stolen land. Folks cheer and then slide back into singing as they file out of the museum, as calmly and peacefully as they first entered. Towards the end, you can hear museum staff complaining about the protest, accusing the activists of scaring people. And I'd really like to know, what was it that was scary? Was it the 8 or 9-year-old clapping along with the song? I mean, I agree, he should be in school learning about how dangerous migrants are. Or maybe it was the "Children Need Freedom to Grow" banner with the terrifying little sunflower on it. Of course, all joking aside, what's really scary for the museum staff is having to square with history. Square with history is scary, yes. So as the staff shoots out these bogus accusations, one of the activists who's holding a small child simply answers, "Well, we're gonna leave now, so thank you." And then, guess what happens? They leave. But it doesn't end there. Apparently horrified at the idea of sunflowers, military police show up at the scene and block the path of protesters. Again, once they've already left the building, while they're just in the parking lot. The military police proceed to collect IDs and run plates before finally letting everyone go without making any arrests. And that really seemed to be that. Tornillo the Occupation posted on their page, quote, "Thank you for all of your support. We have a weekend full of action, so stay tuned." And they let this action and the brief encounter with military police slide off their shoulders as they remained focused on the upcoming events. And I want to make sure that I'm clear on this one point. I'm not getting this information from a snaking game of telephone or someone who says that they were there. I am getting this from public videos posted on the Tornillo the Occupation's Facebook page. That's how I know what went down. That's how I know it was incredibly chill. And that's how I know that we even have a fucking Border Patrol museum. That's a thing. That we're super proud of. The murder, the savage beating and jailing of refugees and migrants. Let's build a museum to that. Actually, I have an idea. Take all the Confederate statues, you remember that fight, shove them in this building, and then we can have a history of white supremacist, colonialist, imperialist assholery museum, and no one is allowed to leave until they've spent 10 minutes looking at this map. I think that's fair. Because I had to learn shit like the presidents of the capital of Montana when I was in school, and it's way more useful for kids to learn the indigenous history of the land that they stand on than having to regurgitate mindless memorized facts that they'll just forget as soon as they get the damn lollipop. But as of now, we do have a Border Patrol museum that does glorify the horrors meted out by this agency. And on February 16th, there was an action at said museum that was poignant, powerful, and peaceful. Indeed, outside of the military police blockade, it's really no wonder folks thought nothing more of it. They were in the midst of a series of actions, which we covered again back in episode 191 when we spoke with Elizabeth Vega, an organizer with Tornillo the Occupation, who told us about the variety of actions and tactics that the group was using, including colorful kites and banners that sought to make contact with kids inside the detention center. And thanks to activist pressure, Tornillo's actually closed. But don't get too excited. Since the shutdown of the Tornillo camp, youth have been sent in droves to Homestead Detention Center, located in Homestead, Florida, on an Air Reserve base. As of April 11th, 1 in 6 of the 12,500 migrant minors currently in custody of the U.S. government are at this location. People involved in the Tornillo occupation shifted their focus to Homestead and for the past 2 months have been holding space just outside the camp. Again, using a variety of artful and colorful tactics to not only raise awareness among community members and the nation, but to also, again, make contact with youth inside the camp. Standing on ladders with signs so that youth can see messages above and beyond the barriers of their detention. Now, seeing images and or video of any of these actions, one might be tempted to ask how in the hell any of it amounts to criminal charges. And while it seems a mystery why law enforcement picked out these 16 specific people out of 50 plus, if you look at what's at stake here, the fascist pushback is really no surprise. First, these relatively small groups of activists have gotten a lot of media attention. Folks around the country are getting a glimpse into these imperialist disasters thanks to this work on the ground. Secondly, these activists are getting in the way of that empire's push to dehumanize and oppress. Besides being the driving force in the shutdown of the youth detention camp at Tornillo, their diversity of tactics includes bringing to light such practices as putting ads out for child abuse specialists. Earlier this month, activists blew the whistle on an ad for a so-called youth care worker at the Homestead camp, writing that staff must at all times be physically able to run, jump, lunge, twist, push, pull, apply approved restraint techniques, and otherwise manage or coerce the full weight of an infant or adolescent. The listing was soon taken down, but even lawmakers have been unable to see for themselves what's actually going on inside these camps. In early April, 3 Florida congresswomen were denied entry into Homestead, citing a lack of proper notice, despite the fact that members of Congress are legally allowed to access such sites. Now, take into consideration that earlier this year, the federal government received more than 4,500 complaints in 4 years about the sexual abuse of immigrant children who were being held at government-funded detention facilities. And that's just the numbers of those who have officially complained. And that's only including sexual abuse, not other physical or mental abuse. Put simply, outside of any accountability or oversight, we are locking up children, separating them from their families, marking them unaccompanied at a heavily militarized border, then shoving them in cages where they are sexually, physically, and or mentally abused, with no sense of when they'll be let go. This is our America. And this is what activists like those involved in the homestead occupation are demanding an end to. And to circle back, that is precisely why they are being targeted. Because beyond stirring up media attention, beyond standing in the way of ICE, DHS, and Border Patrol, they are standing in the way of huge corporate profits. Comprehensive Health Services, or CHS, the corporation that owns and operates Homestead, has a lucrative business going with the federal government. If we look at just the Homestead camp, the government, according to their own federal database, first paid CHS a little over $22 million for 500 beds at Homestead, but then amended the agreement to accommodate double that number in May of 2018. Less than 2 months later, the ORR increased its emergency shelter operations at Homestead to 1,350 beds, which resulted in CHS snagging another award from the government, this time worth $234 million over a 9-month period. The latest amendment to the agreement in late March increased the number of beds at Homestead from 1,600 to 2,350. And as this investigative report, in Forbes by the way, points out, Homestead is only a start for CHS. In January, it received licenses to run 3 shelters for unaccompanied minors in Texas. As of March 21st, it housed 531 migrant children in that state. It received revenues of over $61 million from its first year of operations in Texas and $5.2 million in what it labels as fee/income, according to the company's fiscal plan dated June 2018. These companies are making bank off of throwing kids into cages, where I will say again, because we need to fucking reckon with this, kids are being physically, emotionally, and mentally abused on top of the anguish of being separated from your family and thrown into a cage simply for seeking asylum. And this is why activists are waking up to find warrants out for their arrest. That's why earlier this month, 2 college students who spoke out against Border Patrol at a job fair at the University of Arizona were charged with a misdemeanor. Because when you stand in the way of corporate profits, you stand in the way of empire. And when you stand in the way of empire, you must be made an example of. As supporters of Tornado activists have noted, this is nothing but retaliatory political theater. But it is political theater that aims to silence dissent, to slow down the movements for justice by burdening us with legal fights and fees. Seriously, where are the state or federal cases against the fascist militias who are detaining migrants at gunpoint along the border? On April 18th, the ACLU wrote in a letter, 2 nights ago, April 16th, an armed fascist militia organization describing itself as the United Constitutional Patriots arrested nearly 300 people seeking safety in the U.S., including young children near Sunland Park, New Mexico. The vigilante members of the organization, including Jim Benvey, who posted videos and photographs of the unlawful arrest to social media, are not police or law enforcement, and they have no authority under New Mexico or federal law to detain or arrest migrants in the U.S. Can you imagine if there were folks down there with semi-automatic machine guns handing out water to migrants? I assume they'd find themselves in very much the same boat as the folks who put out water jugs for migrants without any military weaponry, which, for those of you unfamiliar with that case, activists with the group No Mas Muertes, or No More Deaths, have been charged with federal crimes for leaving water for desperate migrants crossing the desert. But hey, being a white supremacist fascist and kidnapping refugees at gunpoint, thanks for helping Uncle Sam do his job. I'm actually kind of surprised that they haven't been awarded a Medal of Honor for that. The stark contrast of these battles at the border only highlight the very foundations of this country: white supremacy, violence, and subjugation. The goal of our government now is as it's always been: silence those who demand justice. But as Anna Tiffany DeVeze, one of the 16 charged in El Paso, wrote in a recent press release following the issuance of her warrant, I cannot allow my work to be criminalized. I continue to stand with my community in all efforts to defend human rights. I will not be intimidated. I am not ashamed, and I am not afraid. Just as these activists are using their bodies, their minds, and their voices to tell children in camps that they are not alone, it is our job not as citizens or as activists, but as human beings, to show these activists that they are not alone. To stay updated and to learn more about how to assist in the ongoing occupation at Homestead Camp, go to the Witness Tornillo Target Homestead Facebook group. You can also donate to the Legal Defense Fund at the bit.ly link below, and we will put that link in the show description as well. Shifting now from the front lines of one fight to another, some of you watching the show may be familiar with the breathtaking beauty of Northern California forests, where redwoods suddenly open up to a seemingly endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, framed by jagged rocks and sun-diamond-flecked inlets. And roughly 200 miles north of San Francisco, the Mattole River begins its journey to the sea, through the kind of awe-inspiring forest and mountain landscape that you really expect to come with a David Attenborough narration. In the native language of the Sinkyone Indians, Mattole means clear water. But thanks to decades of intense logging in these late succession forests following World War II, that clear water has darkened, threatening the entire ecosystem in the Mattole watershed, and thereby linking the work of river protection and restoration with the work of protecting trees from the insatiable greed and boundless stupidity of the logging industry. In 40 years, between 1947 and 1988, 91% of old-growth trees in the Mattole watershed have been clear-cut. 91%. And that's only till 1988. Today, precious little is left of the coniferous forest that once blanketed huge swaths of the Pacific Northwest. As Robert Yosha, a fisheries biologist and Lost Coast League member, which is a grassroots organization working to save 18,000 acres in the Mattole River region from logging, noted in an interview last year, coastal Douglas firs are comparable to redwoods in size and carbon sequestration potential. There's evidence, in fact, that they have the biological potential to exceed redwoods in height, and that they were the tallest trees on the planet prior to Euro-American settlement. We don't see those trees now, because they were all logged. A particularly contentious area of the Mattole River region is along what's known as Rainbow Ridge. Here, roughly 1,100 acres of late succession Douglas fir and associated hardwoods remain, some upwards of several hundred years old. Despite the ecological power and importance of these forests, for the aforementioned greed and stupidity of the logging industry, these trees are but a chance to make a buck. Thankfully for the trees who have no tongues, as the Lorax noted, there are those willing to stand up to Humboldt Redwood Company and loudly protest, blockade, and impede logging plans. Last week, we sat down with a forest protector known as Butternut from the group Save the Mattole's Ancient Forests to discuss their work, the disgusting tactics of the logging industry, the decades-long fight to protect Rainbow Ridge, and the wooded road ahead. We have a short segment of that interview here to share with you now. Take a look.
The area that we're fighting for is at the headwaters. That's where Humboldt Redwood Company has timberlands. And it's been about 20 years that people have been doing forest defense on Rainbow Ridge, which is at the headwaters of the North Forks of the Mattole. The timber company that we're dealing with right now, Humboldt Redwood Company, it seems like they're about 8 or 9 years behind on their logging plans. So they were unable to log all of last year and the year prior, probably largely because of forest defenders blockading roads. Rainbow Ridge is naturally supposed to be a mix of pockets of forest and meadows, and they plant the meadows with dug fir seedlings. So they're just trying to turn the whole thing into a tree plantation.
So I wanted to ask you about that because there was something interesting in an article about the work that you're doing, the distinction between natural forest versus tree plantations. Because I think a lot of people have this idea as long as they replant a tree for every tree they cut down, or almost, then who cares? Talk a little bit about that distinction.
Yeah, this is a really good point. So when you walk through a tree plantation versus an old growth forest, the difference is so obvious. You actually can't even walk through a tree plantation because the young trees are so close together, and they're all growing, their branches just grow into each other. And an old growth forest, the trees will be more sparse and there'll be like less trees and larger trees with some younger trees growing up. So one of the things that in HRC's definition of old growth forest is that if the forest has to have like a certain number of trees over a certain diameter per acre. But one of the characteristics of old growth, or what we call like late successional or late seral, is that there'll be a mix of different species, and the trees will be like there'll be more space in between them and more undergrowth. So there sometimes won't even be like even in an area that's forested, that's not a meadow, and that hasn't ever been logged, there might not be enough old Doug fir trees to qualify as old growth. So then they can cut in that area, even though like the trees there are old growth. So we don't even like to use the word old growth very much because it's such a disputed term. So late successional or late seral sort of refers to the forest's like development and where it gets to a point where it's mature.
Something that I found interesting was obviously California is still reeling from massive fires, and there's no indication that this coming spring and summer will be any kinder in terms of fire conditions. And one of the things that I thought was interesting was because of the hack and squirt technique, which you can speak to, it just leaves dead trees that are still standing. So you basically have standing matches in high-risk fire areas. Talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, this is true. So the practice that you mentioned, hack and squirt, is where they'll go through an area that has a bunch of hardwood species. So oaks and madrones and bay trees and other trees like that. And those are unmarketable species. HRC can't sell them. So in their mind, they're useless. In their mind, they're weed species that they just need to get rid of, even though that's part of like the native forest. Those are native species. So they'll go through and they make these cuts at about like chest height on the tree, and they inject an herbicide called imazapyr that kills the tree, but they don't actually chop the tree down. So you'll walk through these forests, and it's like a ghost town. The trees are all standing dead, and their leaves are brown, and they all have these like scars on them. It's just like really unsettling, and it's an insane fire, is like you said, to leave all of these standing dead trees in the forest. So Mendocino Redwood Company has been doing this all over Mendocino County, and voters there passed a measure to try to curb them from doing that, but they're still doing it. So the first round is they do imazapyr through hack and squirt, and then they'll come back, and sometimes the trees will regrow from the base with new growth, and so they'll apply glyphosate, which is an ingredient in Roundup, or other herbicides to kill that. And so all of these herbicides are like as we know, Roundup is super toxic, and we'll find like empty herbicide containers in the forest.
And part of the issue that you mentioned is like, oh well, they passed this regulation, but they're still doing it. I mean, enforcement is a big deal, and in these mostly wild areas, or not like sparsely populated areas, there's not like regulators sitting there waiting for somebody to come by and inject a tree full of herbicide.
The closest public road is like 15 miles from the timber harvest plans that we're dealing with right now. So the only way to know what's going on out there is to be out there. So it's basically, we're just out there year round, just monitoring, looking for what they're doing. And we do occasionally catch them breaking the rules.
And what is that like when that happens, when you see them doing it? What are there altercations or?
Well, at times we just try to document it. We just try to take photos or video and be like, this is what they're doing, and make it available to the public. And then occasionally allies of ours who work with above ground groups will engage with them and be like, hey, there's evidence that this is happening. So for example, last summer, forest defenders put up a blockade on the only access road into this one area that has like thousands of acres of timber harvest lands. Thousands of acres owned by HRC in which there are timber harvest plans. And the blockade was up for some time. I could tell you more about the crazy stories that happened there. But then when HRC was able to get the blockade down, there was kind of a synchronicity where a local nonprofit, Lost Coast League, filed a grievance with the Forest Stewardship Council, which is the kind of like non-governmental organization that certifies Humboldt Redwood Company's lumber as so-called sustainable. And so this FSC complaint triggered a whole grievance process that then we suspect that might be why HRC wasn't able to log for the rest of the summers, because they were like mired in that process. And so part of the Lost Coast League's complaint included stuff that forced offenders had seen out there.
And looking ahead here, what do you think will be there? You mentioned that they're 8 or 9 years behind, thanks to the moves that the various coalitions have been doing up there. What do you think their moves will be this year? There was something that I read about that a timber harvest permit is running out in September.
Yeah, it's true. One THP that they first filed in 2012 is expiring this September, so they don't have very much time left, because the process of like cutting trees and then hauling them out does take time. Another THP in that same area expires 2 years from now, and they just filed this new THP, so they obviously have their sights on harvesting in this area, not just harvesting timber, but also building roads and herbiciding.
We must do all that we can to preserve the forests that we have left, for they are the answer to so many of our growing problems. They are heat sinks for rising temperatures, oxygen craters for rising CO2 levels and ocean acidification, and of course, they are the homes and sustenance for dozens of fragile and suffering ecosystems, and that includes those of human beings as well. So to hear the full interview, check out our social media pages and YouTube to see the full posting. You can also check out our podcast, which airs every Friday on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, and Libsyn. Follow, plug in, and support Save the Mattole's Ancient Forest by going to facebook.com/Save the Mattole Forest. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for our newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some roster through. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been begging our bitch by